Hey, Sue, let me go ahead and continue admitting people. And you might want to explain the prompt that might have just popped up on people's screen about recording today.
Okay. All right. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Noontime Knowledge. Today's meeting is being recorded, so if you do not want to be recorded, please click on the little stop video icon at the bottom of your screen. You will not be disconnected from the meeting doing that. You also note that your microphones have been muted, and we will selectively unmute them when we get to the question and answer session. There are two ways that you can submit your questions. First of all, you can click on the little chat button at the bottom, which looks like a little speech bubble, and then type in your question in the panel and be sure to hit enter so that it will be submitted. The second way is to click on the participants button, which looks like two little people. That's also at the bottom. And then click on the blue hand that will be there. And that will be a request to have your microphone unmuted so that you can then ask your question. We'll be going in order of people who have submitted questions. And if you have any problems or any questions, just send me a private chat and we'll see if I can't help you out with that. And we should be beginning very shortly.
Well, I hope everyone was able to hear Sue's welcome. She described that we were recording today's session. And again, if you joined after that announcement, you don't wish to be part of that recording, just stop your video camera and you'll be able to exclude yourself from the video being captured here in the main room. It's my pleasure today to welcome and introduce Phil Niss, who will be our featured speaker. Phil's presentation is titled Mennonites in the Valley. He's going to cover Mennonite history, culture, migration, and settlement here in the central Shenandoah Valley region. And I just wanted to provide a quick introduction to Phil and his bio and say thank you for him volunteering his time to make this possible today. This is available open freely to the public. We're recording it with Phil's consent for playback on our website. We'll also share that video link on Facebook. But Phil is volunteering his time today so that we can learn and be together while remaining safe at home. Phil Niss, he grew up in a Mennonite family in Florida, but has spent 35 years in the Mennonite community in Harrisonburg, and most of that time has been in church leadership. He's pastored 2 local Mennonite congregations, including 24 years as senior pastor at Parkview Mennonite Church. Parkview is a great friend also of lifelong learning. We host several classes there. He holds a master in divinity from Eastern Mennonite Seminary in Harrisonburg and a doctor of ministry from Northern Seminary in Lombard, Illinois. He's married with 3 daughters, 2 sons-in-laws, 4 grandchildren, and also enjoys photography, hiking, and roasting coffee. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Phil, and he's going to be the star of our show for this next little bit. When we get to the end, we will have a Q&A session. Sue explained how that works. When we get to that part of the program, we will also provide some other instructions just to reiterate how you may participate at that time. Phil, I'm going to mute my microphone. Feel free to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rodney, and welcome all of you. It's good to have a big crowd here, as I understand. So I think we'll enjoy this time of interaction. What I am sharing today is generally the opening hour or so of the session for my 5-week course on Mennonites in the Valley that maybe some of you have already taken. If that is the case, you'll hear some material again, so it'll be review for some of you. If you haven't yet taken the class, maybe this will be a little bit of a teaser for registering for it later on. But in addition to this overview that I'll be doing today, then we spend some weeks personally interacting with the various Mennonite communities in this area. And just to clarify, in case any of you wonder, I'm not standing out in the middle of a cornfield in Dayton, Virginia, in the middle of Mennonite community. I just thought that would be an appropriate background. And as far as I know, Sue is not in the Caribbean, and Rodney is also not outside on the JMU campus, but we can pretend. So I'm going to just jump right in and try to get through this in a brief amount of time. I'm covering a lot of detailed and complex church history. So by necessity, I'm going to be generalizing a lot of things and rushing over a lot of things. So if some of you are well read in the area of church history, you might hear me say a few things that you might want to say yes, but, and I mostly know about those yes buts, but I'm going to be skipping over a lot of that just in order to get through the material. So Mennonites. We trace our roots to the Reformation in 16th century Europe. That Reformation, before I go any further, let me share my screen so that you can, now let's see here, let me go full screen here so I can get this done right. Okay, now can you all see the shared screen now? I hope. Great. Yeah, Mennonites trace our roots to the Reformation in 16th century Europe. And this Reformation started with Martin Luther nailing 95 theses or 95 complaints about the Catholic Church to the doors of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. And this launched a major Protestant revolution, or Reformation rather, across Europe, with different branches and streams all protesting, Protestant, some aspect of the dominant Roman Church. We sometimes call it the magisterial Reformation because these reformers gave the civil authorities, the magistrates, a major role in helping to govern the church in order to keep an orderly society. And this was the primary expression of the Reformation. And this gave birth to Lutherans and Presbyterians and Episcopals and Congregationalists and Reformed and many other denominations. There was also a left-wing minority movement within the Reformation, sometimes called the Radical Reformation, because they thought that the reformers did not go far enough, and they believed that the church should be free of these civil authority structures and should govern itself by scripture and conscience. And they were the first to articulate the belief that church and state should be separate, and thus became known as a free church movement. The beginning of this movement, or at least one of the primary beginnings, took place right here at this specific church, the Grossmünster Cathedral in the canton of Zurich, Switzerland, whose pastor was Ulrich Zwingli, one of the major Protestant reformers. Zwingli came to Zurich in 1519 and soon began teaching the Bible and taking issue with some of the church traditions, but keeping close ties with the magistrates, the civil authorities. You'll notice in this statue of him right outside the church that he is holding both a Bible and a sword, representing the powers of God and the powers of the state. Zwingli gained some enthusiastic followers, including Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz. Zwingli reformed the Catholic liturgy, started preaching through one of the Gospels instead of following the liturgical calendar, made changes in the Eucharist, removed icons and statuary, removed music from the church, instruments and singing. But this was a city-state, so the city council, the magistrates, had to approve any of these changes, and Zwingli was very reluctant to put pressure on the council and deferred the final decision to them. Manz and Grebel and other radicals were sharply opposed to that approach, especially on certain points: infant baptism and whether to continue the Mass as a rite performed by a priest, or to celebrate it rather as the Lord's Supper shared as a meal for all. So as this movement developed, many parents were refusing to have their infants baptized, and that caused some problems with the authorities. So to settle the matter, there was a disputation held before the town council on January 17 of 1525. Not too surprisingly, Zwingli was declared the winner of that disputation. The next day, the council decreed that the radicals should stop arguing with Zwingli and get with the program, and they needed to baptize their infants within 8 days, and they needed to stop meeting together. 4 days later, on January 21, the radicals met together in this house. This is the home of Felix Manz. One of the leaders, named George Blaurock, walked over to Conrad Grebel, knelt down, and said, "Baptize me." Whereupon Grebel baptized Blaurock, and then Blaurock baptized Grebel, and proceeded to baptize all the other adult believers in the room. Almost immediately, they started preaching their understanding of the gospel in the streets of the town and attracting many followers, and persecution began in earnest. This is how their derogatory nickname, Anabaptist, came about. It means literally baptized again. The Anabaptists themselves did not like that label. They said their infant baptism was not a true baptism, so they were not baptized again. They only had one baptism that they recognized, and they referred to themselves by the name the Swiss Brethren rather than Anabaptists. But eventually that Anabaptist nickname did catch on across Europe. Felix Manz became the first Anabaptist martyr when he was executed by drowning here on a fishing platform in the Limmat River. He was tied up and thrown into the river right under the shadow of the church spires. Many other martyrdoms followed as the movement spread in other communities and areas around Europe. These persecutions and martyrdoms happened by the Swiss Reformed Church and by the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. One brief story of Mayakan Vence, two of her children watched her burn at the stake as they stood at the back of the crowd, but after the crowd left, they sifted around in the ashes and found the tongue screw and kept it. This is a replica of the tongue screws that were used at that time, where they screwed down the tongue and kept these martyrs from giving any testimony to their faith as they were being executed. This free church was a threat not only to the theological positions of the state churches, but it was a real threat to civil order. There's no doubt about that, because the church and state were one. To defy the church was to defy the state and to commit treason. So the church went underground, met in boats and in caves and in homes. And this particular home is the home of George Blaurock, still standing today in Zurich, Switzerland. So persecution scattered the Anabaptists far and wide, both geographically, and it scattered them in belief and practice. Michael Sattler was one of the most influential early leaders to keep some semblance of unity among this disparate group. He was a Benedictine monk, so he had this monastic sensibility that the Benedictines had, with an emphasis on community and discipline, and also a tendency toward being sectarian, being separate from the world. So his background had an influence on the Anabaptists in the early days. He helped this group of Anabaptists to come together and write up a new confession of faith called the Schleitheim Confession, because Schleitheim was where they met to hammer this agreement out, and they did so on February 24 of 1527. This is just about 2 years after the first baptisms in Zurich. The title of this is Brotherly Union of a Number of Children of God Concerning 7 Articles. As always, these old documents often have long, wordy titles, and this was no exception. There were 7 articles, one on baptism, one on the ban, or that is excommunication, how to deal with persons who fall from the faith, the breaking of the bread or communion or Eucharist. A separation from the abomination is the title of the 4th article. That might sound a little bit esoteric, but it simply is referring to the church's need to separate from the world and the evil powers of the world. An article on the pastors in the church and how they should function. An article on the sword, which was the origins of the Anabaptists and Mennonites peace theology. They took Jesus' teachings on peace seriously, that one should love one's enemies and not do violence against them. And the oath. So they believed in not swearing an oath, and they took Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount literally in that article. Well, that did a lot to help keep this disparate group unified, despite the fact that they were scattered around various parts of Europe. But some other things happened that kind of worked against that. One of those was the rise and leadership of Jan van Leyden, or the English version of his name, John of Leyden. He was an Anabaptist leader born in Holland, and he moved to Münster, Germany. He developed this messianic identity, and in Münster set up an Anabaptist theocracy, named himself King David of the New Jerusalem. It was rather apocalyptic in his thinking, and he expelled all Catholics from the city, and he took up the sword, he formed his own militia, was violent toward dissenters, both inside and outside the city of Münster. So this is quite well known in that area. Still to this day, people know about the Münster Rebellion. Eventually, the bishop's army, the Catholic bishop's army, laid siege to the city of Münster, a siege that lasted almost 2 years, and the army was eventually victorious and took over the church and the city again, executed Van Leyden and 2 other leaders and put their 3 corpses in 3 metal cages and hung them on the side of the church tower for all to see. And those cages remain there to this day. So this is what you would see if you were driving down the streets of the city of Munster. Well, as you can imagine, this rebellion and the violent end to it caused persecution against Anabaptists to increase even more, because then they were identified with Jan van Leyden and as sort of proof positive that they were a threat to civil order. And so persecution increased and got even worse. Menno Simons emerged then in the Netherlands as an important leader who was critical in preserving Anabaptists from extinction. He was a priest in the Catholic Church in Holland, this congregation right here. He later wrote, a bit tongue-in-cheek, that he enjoyed the priesthood, a life of playing cards, drinking, and pursuing leisure. But he began to have doubts about the church, and he started studying Martin Luther and his writings and beliefs, and Menno Simons became an evangelical preacher. He heard of the Anabaptists and was impressed by their dedication, but after this tragedy happened in the city of Munster, he became determined to bring unity to the church and to help them work together and to not have these splinter expressions that were violent and so on. So he traveled throughout the Netherlands, preaching the New Testament, preaching Jesus, preaching peace, and trying to draw the Anabaptists together. Well, there was eventually an end to the persecution period. Two major things happened to end this period. One is that some of the churches became more tolerant. Some church leaders, including some Catholic bishops, were convinced that the persecution was wrong. Even though they disagreed theologically, they became protectors of Anabaptists. These early leaders included William of Orange in Holland and Philip I of Hesse in Germany. So there were protectorates where Anabaptists could flee. And they did flee to these places where they could live in peace. And as a result, they became less fiery and evangelical about their faith, evangelistic about their faith. So they assumed a quieter lifestyle so they could live. There's a natural progression there. They became more separatist and sectarian, again, as a protective measure primarily. They became good farmers because they wanted to be self-sufficient. They were unable, for the most part, to be employed in other kind of industries because of who they were. So they needed to be self-sufficient, and they became good farmers. They became known as the Stille im Lande, a German phrase meaning quiet in the land. Quiet in the land, peaceful, gentle, wanting to cause no trouble for authorities. So a pretty big contrast from their early days when they were preaching and causing a lot of uproar in the various parts of Europe. Many of them migrated to the Prussian Delta. Others remained in Holland and Switzerland and Germany. Now I'm going to take us down a little side trail for a bit and tell you a personal story. Most of the pictures that you've seen here around Zurich were taken by me in 2005 when my wife Irene and I took a 25th wedding anniversary trip to Europe to explore some of our roots. On Sunday morning, November 21, we worshiped here at the Grossmünster Cathedral, the Swiss Reformed Church, where Zwingli was pastor, the church that killed my spiritual ancestors over the issue of infant baptism. We were met there in the church on Sunday morning by Peter Detweiler, a Swiss Reformed pastor who I learned to know and had a contact with. So Peter sat between Irene and me and translated the service into English so that we would know what was going on. The pastor of the church at the time was a woman, the first woman pastor in its 800-year history as a congregation. And they were having an infant baptism there that morning. The pastor was baptizing one of a pair of twins. The other twin had died at birth. I watched the pastor take this baby in her arms and baptize her, and I saw the parents and grandparents and extended family fighting back tears, and I was personally deeply moved to be able to witness this sacred ritual. After the service, Peter took us down to the Limot River and showed us a historical marker, noting the place where Felix Mons, the first Anabaptist, was drowned. This marker was new. Only 1 year earlier, in the summer of 2004, an amazing thing happened. A reconciliation conference was initiated by the Swiss Reformed Church of the Canton of Zurich, and they invited Swiss Mennonites and Mennonites and Amish from North America to participate. And a statement of regret was read by the president of the Swiss Reformed Church, in which he said, in part, and I'm quoting here, "We, representatives of the Reformed State Church of the Canton of Zurich, confess that the persecution of the Anabaptists was a betrayal of the gospel and that our Reformed forefathers were in error on this issue. We acknowledge the faithful of the Anabaptist tradition as our sisters and brothers and their churches as part of the body of Christ." So this marble plaque was unveiled along the Limot River that honored Felix Mons, you see his name there, the first Anabaptist martyr in Zurich, and Hans Landis, the last Anabaptist martyr in Zurich, who was beheaded in 1614. Now, it so happens that Hans Landis is not only my spiritual ancestor, but a biological one as well. He is my 11th great-grandfather. So, moments before, I was being deeply moved in worship with my Swiss Reformed brothers and sisters at the Grossmünster and witnessing the pastor perform an infant baptism. And now I'm standing beside a Swiss Reformed pastor looking at a plaque calling attention to the fact that one of his ancestors executed one of my ancestors because he tried to get the pastor of that same church to stop baptizing infants. And I just stood there and took a deep breath and thought, what an amazing moment this is. And I think the fact that these reconciliation conferences have occurred, and there's been reconciliation also and work being done between Mennonites and Lutherans and Mennonites and Catholics, we're at a different stage now in our history. And I think that we can no longer tell these martyr stories in the same way because of those beautiful reconciliation events that have happened and are continuing to happen. But now back to the larger story. As we look at how Mennonites and Anabaptists got to from where they started to where they are today. So let's review the beginning of Anabaptism in Switzerland with Felix Mons and company, the leadership of Menno Simons that emerged in the Netherlands, and the scattering continued to various protected areas, including the Vistula Delta in Prussia. So this is what it looked like around the year 1550. The gray areas are where the Anabaptists primarily were located around 1550. So how did Mennonites come to North America and why? Well, that's a complicated question, and I'll try to simplify. There were two major movements to North America that were completely separate and hundreds of years apart. As background, around the 1680s, 130 years after the beginning of Anabaptism, William Penn invites Mennonites and Quakers and other persecuted religious minorities to join the Pennsylvania experiment and freely practice their religion. Those who responded to William Penn's invitation were primarily the Swiss German Mennonites of the Anabaptists. Those were the ones that tended to go to Pennsylvania. And since my ancestors are from Pennsylvania, I can trace many of my biological roots back to this particular area of Switzerland and Germany. However, 200 or 100 years later, in the late 1700s, Catherine the Great invites Mennonites to migrate to Russia. And so they established productive farms in the Volga River region and become quite wealthy, keeping to themselves, not joining the Russian culture, keeping the German language, but contributing to the Russian Empire through their agricultural work. You'll note the pink areas on this map. This is an ethnic map, so the colors correspond to different ethnic groups. And you'll see, if you can see my mouse moving around to the various pink areas in Russia, those were where German-speaking folks settled, mostly Mennonites. But trouble is on the horizon for these Russian German-speaking Mennonites. In the late 1870s, growing Russian nationalism threatened Mennonites' exemption from military service and other religious freedoms. Catherine the Great allowed them to keep their pacifist and separatist positions and did not require them to serve in the Russian military. But generations later, long after Catherine the Great, they weren't enjoying those same exemptions. So because of that pressure to serve in the military, many of them emigrated to Canada and the central United States. So that began the second major wave of Mennonites moving to North America. They were also German-speaking, but culturally distinct from the Swiss Germans who came 200 years before that. And 40 years later, during World War I, there was another wave of emigration from Russia, this time mostly to Canada, Paraguay, and Uruguay, due to the growing pressures under communist rule. So here in North America, this is the scenario. First, Swiss German Mennonites came to Europe, to Philadelphia in the late 1600s at William Penn's invitation, and they slowly and over generations migrated west and south, so that today when you find Mennonite communities in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Virginia, and surrounding states, they virtually all originate with Pennsylvania's first settlers. These are Swiss German Mennonites with little or no Russian connections. The Russian Mennonite emigration establishes colonies in Manitoba and the Northern Plains states. And of course, the second wave of Russian Mennonites end up in other parts of Canada and in colonies in Paraguay, Uruguay, and Mexico. So there are still Mennonite colonies that live to themselves in South America and Mexico. And those Mennonites primarily have maintained the German language in their communities and churches much longer than those who came directly from Switzerland and Germany in the 1600s. So just to restate all of this, to boil it down, two entirely separate migration periods, 2 centuries apart. First, the Swiss German to Pennsylvania and beyond, and later German-speaking Russian Mennonites that came in 2 waves themselves, 1870s and 1910s. And these represent 2 culturally distinct Mennonite groups that until more recently had very little to do with each other. All right. So how did these Swiss German Mennonites from Pennsylvania get to Virginia, and why? Note the general path of migration from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or York area, down the valley between the Appalachians and the Blue Ridge. Until 1787, Virginia had a state church, the Anglican Church, of course, since it began as an English colony. And everyone in Virginia was expected to join that church. In the late 1600s, Quakers, also English, were banned and they were not allowed to hold meetings. But by the 18th century, dissenters from the state church were permitted in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So Mennonites, Brethren, Quakers German-speaking Lutherans and other groups came into the valley in that time period, followed by the Baptists just before the American Revolution. So this was the beginning of the breakdown of Virginia's state church system when these other free church folks were coming from Pennsylvania down into Virginia. I've heard it said that one of the reasons Mennonites and Brethren and Quakers were invited to settle in the valley is that these groups had a reputation of a relatively peaceful coexistence with native peoples. So they served as somewhat of a buffer between the English colonists in Southeast Virginia and Native Americans living to the west of the valley. Most Valley Mennonites originated from the Lancaster, York, and Montgomery counties in Pennsylvania, in the area within that circle. And the main migration period was between 1773 and 1820. Obviously a lot of variations on that, but that was the main period. The earliest settlement was actually in 1728 in Page, Frederick, and Shenandoah counties. This settlement was nearly wiped out by an Indian raid in 1758 in Page County. Page County was the scene of what's sometimes called the Rhodes Massacre, when John Rhodes, who was a Mennonite minister, and members of his family were killed near Luray in 1764. There is a historical marker about that event along Route 211, just west of Luray. The next two settlements were made in Rockingham County. The first and largest extended from Edom and Broadway on the east to Turleytown and Coots Store on the west. And this happened around the late 1700s. That settlement of Mennonites soon overflowed to help establish a new and second settlement in the vicinity of Harrisonburg. A third settlement was made soon after the Revolution in Augusta County near Waynesboro. There are coastal settlements in Warwick and Norfolk counties that were begun around 1900, but of a different stock, mostly from Ohio, but from some other places as well. And in the first half of the 1900s, Old Order Amish and Beachy Amish groups established several settlements. Those Old Order Amish no longer remain in Virginia, but in recent years, there have been several newer Amish settlements in South Central Virginia and far southwest tip of Virginia. So just as a point of clarification, we can get more into this later, but the buggy-driving Mennonites you see in Rockingham County are not Old Order Amish, nor have they ever been. They are Old Order Mennonites, a distinct group from Old Order Amish. Now let's zoom in a little closer yet to Rockingham County. And I want to just briefly describe the various Mennonite transitions and divisions that have occurred over the years. So Virginia Mennonite Conference was the organization of all these Mennonite groups in Rockingham County. And that conference was established in 1835 at Weaver's Mennonite Church. If some of you are familiar with Weaver's Church, just to the west of Harrisonburg on Route 33, big gray stone church there. That was the oldest church in the Harrisonburg area, and that's where the Virginia Conference was officially established in 1835. 65 years later, around 1900, there was a division in the Virginia Conference. And that division happened in the Middle District, which was around, well, just south of Hinton, at what is now known as the Bank Church. That Middle District had there was a conflict across the Mennonite Church at that time, but the conflict locally centered on that district, and it revolved around issues of some innovations that were coming into the church at the time, like Sunday schools, revival meetings, and things like that, there was a group strongly opposed to that. And as Virginia Conference was beginning to make more progressive changes in those areas, this group wanted to keep the old order of worship intact. And so they were actually, because they did not go along with the larger conference decision, they were essentially pushed out or excommunicated by the conference and became their own group. And so the old orders that we have in Dayton area now are result of that division in 1900, and their mode of transportation and their style of worship and many things about their life are much the same way they were being practiced in 1900, with some modifications made along the way, of course. But that it's just important to know that when you see Mennonites driving down the road in a buggy, living a life to themselves and fairly separate, and you see Mennonites running a thriving liberal arts university on the north side of town, those are very different groups today who don't have much to do with each other. But before 1900, they were the same group. These were all from the same branch. One additional important division to take note of is the 1972, much more recent division in our conference, where one of the districts separated over a variety of issues, jewelry, use of music in the church, divorce and remarriage, some other things that were a little more controversial in the early 70s. And they formed their own separate conference called the Southeastern Mennonite Conference. And that would include churches like Bank Mennonite, Pike Mennonite, Peak, and others. Bank and Pike would be the two largest ones, but there's quite a large handful of churches today that are collected under this organization called Southeastern Mennonite Conference. But again, they came out of the trunk of the tree, which was Virginia Mennonite Conference. That I should say that division was a much more peaceful one than the 1900 one. I think the people who were part of the leadership of the church at that time did not want some of the things repeated that happened in 1900 that were still painful. So they had a very amicable separation. Agreements were reached about property and things like that. So Virginia Mennonite Conference today has roughly about 70 congregations throughout Virginia and West Virginia, in the DC area, and some even in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So that's a fairly small number compared to other denominations, but it's still significant. The more conservative Southeastern Conference has also grown over time. There are about 16 congregations in Virginia, West Virginia, and Puerto Rico. But now I want to look at this family tree to further explain some of these divisions to you. So again, look at this trunk here at the bottom. I hope you can see my mouse moving around on the screen. So the Virginia Mennonites arrived here in the valley, late 1700s, and lived together as one group for over 100 years. In 1901, this division happened that formed the Old Orders. Now, over time, the Old Order groups themselves have had divisions. So looking at the, well, let's look at 1950s. At that point, there was a group of Old Orders who felt like the restriction on car transportation was one that they weren't willing to continue to live with, and wanted some changes in the area of transportation. And so they aligned themselves with a conference in Pennsylvania called the Weaverland Conference. They're sometimes called Horning Mennonites, named after an early leader. They're sometimes called Black Bumper Mennonites because one of the rules that was established was that they could drive a car as long as they painted the chrome bumpers black to eliminate any showiness in their cars. Of course, this is back in the 50s when all the cars had chrome bumpers. So you could see a black bumper Mennonite coming from miles away because it was an unusual way for a car to look. But today, there is a congregation in the Dayton area, Mount Pleasant Mennonite Church, who is part of this conference, and they do drive black cars. But their order of worship is very similar to the old orders, and a lot of their practices are the same, but they educate through the high school. To the right, oh, and I should also say, on this tree that I drew, right and left are exactly what I'm implying, conservative, progressive. So the branches that are reaching toward the right are the ones who are staying more conservative, and those reaching toward the left are those who are instituting changes. So in 1953, there was another division in the Old Order group. So they became two groups, the Klein-Showalter group and the Wenger group. And the names of these are how they would refer to themselves, and they're generally associated with the bishop who was in charge at the time of the division. And then in much more recently, we're only talking about 14 years ago, there was another division in the Klein-Showalter group. So now there's a Lloyd Wenger group, a Dale Berry group, and a Marion Wenger group of Old Order buggy-driving Mennonites. So it's just interesting to note that when you see buggies on the road, they all look alike. People dress pretty much alike. There are slight differences in some of the rules, lifestyle and restrictions, but by and large, they have similar worship patterns and a lot of other things that are similar. But there are three distinct groups that have entirely separate worship services and bishops and ministers and so on, and do not do very many things collaboratively. Mostly on good terms personally, but just as churches are not collaborating. So that's the Old Order group, this branch over here. And then you move up the trunk here toward the left. Sorry about that. Move up the trunk a little bit to 1972, and this is the Southeastern Conference Division. And then you move further to the left here, and Virginia Mennonite Conference continues to adapt and change over time. We're part of a larger national denomination called Mennonite Church USA. Changes that have happened in the Mennonite Church USA have caused other smaller groups, congregations that have split off and maybe joined with other conferences or have gone independent. So there's a variety of smaller divisions, but today you could look at Mennonites in Rockingham County and roughly, again, this is an overstatement, but roughly group them into three groups: the Old Orders, the Southeastern Conference, and the Virginia Conference. And these dotted lines here would indicate, what are the distinctives between these groups. So the Southeastern Conference would be distinctive from Virginia Conference. A lot of it is they would have a visible difference because of the way they dress. There's more distinctive dress, as well as their worship services. They do not use instruments and musical instruments in their Sunday worship, and there are other rules that we do not have in Virginia Conference. But this group of folks to the left, the Virginia Mennonite Conference, don't have a visible difference to other Christian groups in the area. You would not recognize them walking down the street. And it may not seem very strange to sit in one of their worship services on a Sunday morning. There would be some differences, but it would not feel entirely foreign. But these other groups, you would probably, the differences would be more striking. Finally, before we go to the Q&A, we're doing okay on time, I think. Like to just show you some pictures to give you a sense of the variety of Mennonites that we have in this area. So this is, I'll just run through these pictures somewhat quickly, and we'll have time for conversation. So first, starting with the Virginia Mennonite Conference, the more progressive group that I'm part of at Parkview Mennonite Church, and that the Eastern Mennonite University is affiliated with as well. So there are the conference offices. We have a mission board and a conference offices there in that building on the corner of Parkwood Drive and Route 42. There's a high school, Eastern Mennonite High School. It's not officially under our conference, but it has a close relationship to our conference. That's a K through 12 school. It's my alma mater as well. There's Eastern Mennonite University just up the hill from the high school. As I said, a thriving liberal arts university with many different programs, including a number of graduate programs for master's degrees, and have begun to offer a doctorate as well in one area. So this is this represents the more progressive wing. I also am a proud graduate of this institution. And I should say it's a beautiful place, especially right now, this time of year. This was taken a few years back, but it's about how it looks today. Then a little further up the hill is Eastern Mennonite Seminary that trains pastoral leaders. I'm also a graduate of this institution. So I just kind of worked my way up the hill, starting at the high school and college and then seminary. Before I went to the Midwest to get my doctorate at a Baptist school. But until that, these Mennonite educational institutions are kind of an important part of the Harrisonburg area, and especially the northwest part of Harrisonburg called Parkview. This is an aerial view of the Eastern Mennonite University campus, just to give a picture of that. Also very nearby, adjacent to EMU on the property is this Virginia Mennonite retirement community. This picture was taken a few years back before they changed some of their signage, but it's a large continuum of care community for retirees, open to anyone. Mennonites would be a minority of the residents, but its origins and leadership remain with Mennonites. This again is an aerial view of the VMRC campus. Our congregation, the one I pastor at Parkview Mennonite, is just off this picture to the far right. Some of you maybe have gone to Gift and Thrift or enjoyed a meal at Bowl of Good, or maybe done some financial business at Everence or so forth. Those are all Mennonite run businesses clustered together in the same general area. Much of the proceeds of these businesses, especially Gift and Thrift, goes to Mennonite Central Committee for relief and development work around the world. It's our financial services agency. Here's a picture of the oldest continuously operating Mennonite church in Shenandoah Valley, or in Virginia. This is Trissell's Mennonite Church. That building that you're seeing in this picture no longer exists. It was torn down and this brick building has replaced it. This is west of Broadway, but this is the oldest church, oldest Mennonite church in Virginia. And Zion Mennonite was almost as old. So these were essentially twin churches on the east and the west side of Route 42 in the Broadway area. And largely the reason for establishing these other churches were so that it would, because people got around on horses, with horses, it took a while to get somewhere, so you had to build a church close to where the people lived. Weaver's Mennonite Church, as I mentioned, this is the oldest one in the Harrisonburg area. Their original building was a log cabin structure, but that's their stone building is today. Mount Clinton, just a few pictures of some Mennonite churches. This is Parkview Mennonite, where I'm a pastor currently, on the north side of the EMU campus. Harrisonburg Mennonite Church is the largest Mennonite church in the valley. It's south of town, and it's a little bit off of 42, so you can't quite see it from 42. So if you haven't driven back in there, you may not have ever noticed this building, but it's there, and it's a large, thriving congregation. This is an interior view of it. There are small Spanish-speaking Mennonite churches in the Harrisonburg area. This is one of them. Here's another one that meets at Harrisonburg Mennonite. Here's a church that is multi-ethnic, that the building is in the northeast community of Harrisonburg. So there are African Americans as well as Hispanics and some other folks there as part of that. Now moving to a little more conservative group, the Southeastern Mennonite Conference. This is the Bank Mennonite Church currently. This is where that earliest 1900 division occurred, where the old orders were formed. But this ground here dates back into the 1800s. There's gravestones in the cemetery from that period. This is another church. This is a Raleigh Springs Mennonite Church, part of the Southeastern Conference. Here's one of their institutions. This is actually not officially affiliated with the conference, but it's widely supported by the conference. This is a thriving publication company in the Parkview area, but they service conservative Anabaptist groups across the country, in fact, in some other countries as well. They publish a lot of curriculum for homeschoolers, as well as Christian schools that would be considered conservative Anabaptist. Here is their conference's school, also K to 12, Berea Christian. It's on Garbers Church Road, just south of Harrisonburg High School. So some of you may have gone by that building. This is the interior of that school. Various ages. They even have science labs and teach modern scientific experimental things. A fairly well-rounded educational experience up through grade 12 in this school. They do not practice interscholastic sports, but they have intramural, or they sometimes will play other conservative schools for fun, but they do not compete athletically with other schools. The Old Order Mennonites, these are primarily the buggy driving groups. Here's a picture of what I would call the mother church of the Old Orders. This building was built in 1901 or 2 when it was finished. And this is the building that the group moved into after that division at the Bank Church. And this church is a mirror image, is an exact replica of the Bank Church at that time. This is how all Mennonite churches pretty much looked at that period of time. So when they built a new church building, they built it exactly like the one they left. And this architectural style has remained. So there are now 5 separate church buildings in Rockingham County for the Old Orders, and they all look alike. So this is Pleasant View. And I think I'll show you a few more here shortly. This is just what it looks like when the parking lot is full. That's what it looks like in the wintertime. And by the way, this is not an exclusive group. Visitors are welcome. So if you want to visit one of their worship services sometime, feel free to pull up in your car and walk in, and they will welcome you. Men and women sit on different sides of the building, of the meeting house, but visitors are welcomed. This is a scene from a funeral, graveside service. Bicycles are also an important mode of transportation. Sometimes, depending how far you're going, it's a lot easier and quicker to get there by bicycle than hitching up a horse. So this is the Pleasant View Old Order Mennonite Church. This is the Oak Grove Old Order Mennonite Church. Again, see the similarities? And here's Riverdale Old Order Mennonite Church. Again, exactly the same, pretty much. Slight difference here in the roof line and a little bit architecturally different, but not much. The Ridgeview Old Order Mennonite Church. And then there's a couple more. Here's one of their schools. The Old Orders do have their own school system because they do not approve of education beyond the 8th grade. So they educate their own children with their own teachers themselves who've only had an 8th grade education, and they educate them in 2-room schoolhouses. So scattered across the countryside here in our county are 6 or more 2-room schoolhouses that continue to educate children using what we would consider old-fashioned methods, but they are teaching them basics of reading and writing and even some pre-algebra and history and so on, using conservative curriculum, but good, solid, basic education that's happening, but then stops at 8th grade. So this is a Mountain View school, another view of that school. This is the oldest of the schools. It's right near the Pleasant View Mennonite church. Here's another brick school building, Riverside School. Here's one in the Spring Hill area. But all of these are separated by grades K through 3 are on one side and grades 4 to 8 are on the other side. And then they do some things together, but they teach the school, those two groups separately. Now this is a picture of the Mount Pleasant Mennonite Church, which is the black bumper, car driving Old Order group. And so this is where they meet for their worship. Again, the worship patterns are very similar. Difference in their mode of transportation and the fact that they do educate through the 12th grade. This is what their parking lot looks like on a Sunday. Their school is a Hickory Hollow Christian School, just west of Dayton. A thriving K to 12 school. They have more traditional classrooms by grades, but they do educate their children through high school. Again, sports, they enjoy outdoor activities. They just don't compete with each other. Here's a Burkholder buggy shop. There are several buggy shops in town that build from scratch as well as do repair and service on buggies. As you can imagine, there's a lot of work to be done to maintain these vehicles and make them roadworthy in this area. Just a few additional scenes. I think you can thank some of the conservative Mennonites and Old Order Mennonites who are farmers for preserving much of the agricultural land that's around in our county. Obviously, there are other farmers doing the same thing that are not Mennonite, but many of the farms in the Dayton, Bridgewater area are run by conservative Mennonite families and have preserved a lot of that beautiful landscape that we enjoy. Just a few random pictures there. You should point out that bump on the horizon is Mole Hill. A mole hill is a important geological feature of this area, but it also is kind of a geographical center of the Mennonite and Old Order communities. Many of the Mennonite farms, have a view of Mole Hill from where they are. There are some ways in which these different Mennonite groups do work together. Certainly not enmity between them. It's just that their churches are separate, but they do work together on certain causes, especially when it comes to relief. So there's a relief center in the Hinton area that different groups will come to can meat or dried apples or do other projects for hunger relief in other parts of the world. So here's a group of young Mennonite women peeling and slicing apples for drying apples. And they'll have similar projects like this for meat, canning turkey as well as beef, working together in this way. Every year at the county fairgrounds is a Mennonite relief sale, which again, you'll get a variety of Mennonites coming together to sell things and buy things and eat lots of food and cook a more Brunswick stew than you've ever laid your eyes on before. And you'll see Mennonites of all stripes there, as well as people from the general community. They're enjoying that sort of festive atmosphere together. Selling quilts to raise money. Last year, I don't have the number right off the top of my head, but it's over $300,000 was raised at the sale last year for relief work around the world. Another place that we kind of cross paths is at Crossroads Valley Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center, where there are some buildings that were preserved and are sitting there on that property to tour and for educational purposes. A lot of our school children get to tour these buildings on field trips and see how life was in the 1800s. Well, that's the end of I think I've gone just a little bit over an hour. But I'm done. So I'm going to turn it over back to Rodney or Sue, whoever wants to moderate the Q&A time. And I will do what I can to answer your questions.
Well, Phil, this is Rodney. First of all, I want to thank you for sharing about this important part of our community and its history. We do have 2 questions by chat. If we have other questions, you can either raise your hand using the virtual blue palm in the participant panel or write your question in the chat window. But Phil, the first question comes from Gail, and she wanted to know, she realized that there were 2 doors on the meeting houses. And why is that so?
That's correct. Those 2 doors are, one door is for the men and one for the women. It might seem like that's a sort of a unique Mennonite thing, but actually it's not. Many denominations back in the 1800s would have had similar practices of having men and women on different parts of the building, but that's how they still do it today. So the men go in, and it varies from one church building to another. There's not one, it's not always right or always left. So you have to know when you're going there, which way it is in that building. But the women do sit on one side and the men on the other.
Phil, the second question comes from Brian and Pam, and they said they would be interested in knowing some of the main differences between old order Amish and old order Mennonites.
Yes, very briefly, the old order Amish, they trace the division that happened between Amish and Mennonites actually happened back in Europe in the post-Reformation years. So there was a Anabaptist leader by the name of Jacob Amann who felt that one of the things that Anabaptists were losing was the practice of the ban. In that Schleitheim Confession, the second article was about the ban and how you deal with persons who've fallen from the faith. So he felt pretty strongly to preserve that and to do social isolation for persons who had fallen from the faith, to give them motivation to rejoin. So while Mennonites tended to be wanting to have more connections with those who were on the edges of their faith group, whereas the Amish were wanting to practice that social isolation more. Now that's an oversimplification. There were other issues at stake, but that division happened in Europe and existed before they migrated to the US. But the difference between Mennonites and Amish at that time was not so great. Pre-1900s, in the 1800s, of course, everyone was using horse and buggy for transportation and did not have electricity that was connected to the grid and things like that. So the differences were not quite so stark. But today, the differences between old order Mennonite and old order Amish, several things to point out. One would be old order Amish, the men wear beards, no mustaches, but full beards, untrimmed beards. And they continue to use the German language in their worship, and they speak it at home. That's their primary. That's their lingua franca is Pennsylvania Dutch or Low German, and that continues to be the language of their worship. The old order Mennonites in our area have clean shaven. The men are clean shaven. They have a different style hat and clothing. They do use electricity in their homes, and they do not speak German. Some of the older ones might still remember some German, but most Mennonites in our area, including the buggy-driving Mennonites, don't know German. And if you talk to one of them, you'll think you're talking to any other Virginia native. They have the same Southern drawl as other people do that are native to this area. They do not have that sort of Dutchified German accent that Amish tend to have. But schooling is the same, 8th grade schooling, a lot of similarities. The buggy shops, it's helpful for them to intersect with Amish groups in other parts of the country because they need to buy parts and things like that. So there's back and forth, but there are distinct differences.
Phil, we have 2 questions that piggyback off of each other. The question concerns the difference between Mennonites and Brethren. And then the second part of that question is there any specific difference related to the acceptance of converts?
Yeah, the difference between Brethren and Mennonite is a little more blurry. We actually, up to now, we have the same blue hymnal. We co-published our hymnal. We're not the same denomination. We have a different confession of faith document, but there's a lot of similarities. The Brethren also have their origins in the sort of left wing of the Reformation in Europe, although they align themselves a bit more with the pietistic movement, and so more emphasis on the inner spiritual transformation and experience, whereas Mennonites tended to be more focused on discipleship and behavior things. That's, again, I'm oversimplifying, but they do have a different history. There's a different mode of baptism. The Brethren immerse. So the early Brethren were called dunkards because they dunked for baptism. Mennonites tended to pour. But again, those are minor differences, but a lot of similarities and a lot of collaborative work. As I said, the Heritage Center on Garbers Church Road is jointly and equally owned and operated by Brethren and Mennonites in the area. So we do work together quite a lot. As far as converts, it's not a moving between Brethren and Mennonite is not much of an issue there at all. Of course, joining an Old Order Mennonite group or an Old Order Amish group the bar is set quite a bit higher because of all the requirements that are required of a person to do that. It happens, it's pretty rare, but it can happen. And in our community, there have been some people who joined the Old Order Mennonite group, but it would be a pretty long process, and they would have to make sure that they know what they're getting into and all the sacrifices they would be required to make to do that. But it does not require, it's not a birthright. You join by choice. That's one of the essences of Anabaptism is it's a believer's church. You join because you accept the belief system and consciously choose to adopt that as your own.
Sue, I'm going to check with you before I read the next question, just in case you've received any private messages. Any questions on your end?
No, I don't think so.
No, I have none.
There's one more here in the chat area, Phil, from Chris Edwards. Chris asked, I've heard that Mennonite churches, although all are pacifists, have some nuances of difference in such issues as whether members can serve in the military. Are there denominational differences in policy on pacifism? Yes,
thanks. And that question comes from my next door neighbors who's listening right next door to me. So she could have hollered out the door, but thank you, Chris. Yeah, there are differences, nuances of differences in how at the denominational level and at the level of our confession of faith, there are clear statements about pacifism and nonviolence, and those would be part of both Mennonite and Brethren and Old Order Mennonite official statements of faith. In terms of their actual practice, congregations have a great deal of latitude on some of these things, so there are differences between congregations and how membership is handled. There would be some more strict ones where they would say that a member cannot serve in the military. That would certainly be the case for Old Order Mennonites and the Southeastern Conference. I think any military membership or oath would preclude them from being a member of those churches. There is some more acceptance among Brethren and Mennonite churches that differ from congregation to congregation. But the official church teaching is still clearly pacifist and would want the ministers to be teaching that as well. But again, not all pastors are committed to that position. So there would be some differences there.
Phil, there's a question from Barbara in the chat area. You talked about migration, but this concerns more modern migration. Are there many young people who choose to leave their community or this way of life?
Yes, there are. And I think you would find different reasons. Of course, as you look at the different groups, if the three major groups, the buggy-driving old orders, the middle ground Southeastern Conference, and the more progressive Virginia Conference Mennonites, young people would be leaving all of those, but they would be joining different groups. So perhaps an old order Mennonite young person just wants a bit more freedom to do something, like maybe they want a college degree, maybe they want to work in medicine, and they realize that choice would separate them from their church, and so they may join a Southeastern Conference church, where they could have that, they could follow that path, career path, while maintaining a good, warm relationship with their relatives in the old orders. So there are many families that are blended families, extended families are blended between old orders and Southeastern Conference and even Virginia Conference Mennonites. As a pastor at Parkview, I have done some funerals of members who were buried at, say, Bank Mennonite Church because they grew up, or their families grew up in the Southeastern Conference, and that's where their roots are. So yes, there's movement, sometimes to a slightly more progressive Mennonite group, but other times to a non-Mennonite Christian group, and sometimes young people leave the church altogether. The old order Mennonites, mostly in our area, do not practice this strict social ban that the Amish do. So if a young person left, they would still be in good graces with their family, presuming that their family is a healthy, loving, supportive family. But in many Amish communities, church rules would require the families to shun or to socially distance themselves. Social distance means something else right now, but I mean to actually not allow them to eat meals at the same table and things like that. But that's not the case with most old order groups in our area.
Phil, we had advertised that our session would go to 1:30. I have two more questions here where we have about 10 minutes. It says, Sheila says she grew up among Midwest groups and they're still speaking German and hold to their own. Could you talk about those differences?
Yes, groups in the Midwest that are still speaking German, there's a lot of, I mentioned those two main migration groups, the Swiss Germans that came in the late 1600s and the Russian Mennonite German-speaking folks that came 200 years later. There have been divisions in both of those groups into many smaller groups. There are, I don't know the number, frankly, many dozens of separate Anabaptist Mennonite groups, some of whom maintain use of the German language in worship, or at least a lot of the German culture, foods and other customs, and live fairly separately from the world. Others who are more progressive in terms of engagement with the world and education, but maybe more conservative theologically. There's just about every variety you can imagine. So I don't know specifically what groups the person asking the question is thinking of, but there are many varieties. I'll just say it that way.
Phil, I've got two questions here, and I'll just tell you both of them and you can answer them one after another. The last one was, are old order marriages arranged? And then another question is, what is the significance of, quote, the sin sifters worn by some Mennonite women?
Okay. The first question is pretty easy to answer. No, old order marriages are not arranged. There's certainly there would be an expectation that the families are working that are in agreement and are supportive, but they are not arranged marriages. So there's dating that happens within the old order community. It's just a different kind of dating. They often date at church events. They often have young people's events for singing hymns, that kind of thing, on a weekend, and that's where some of the dating happens. Sin Sifter is is a is a lighthearted nickname for a prayer veiling that many women wear in the more conservative groups wear. The Virginia Conference Mennonites tend not to wear those anymore. There would be some older members or maybe some more conservative groups within the Virginia Conference that you might see a few of these prayer veilings. The one that had been typically worn by, well, my mother, for instance, when I was growing up, she would have worn a traditional kind of prayer covering that was made out of a sort of a white netting, very fine netting, and sat on the top of her head. And the reason for that was came out of the Apostle Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians about women praying with their heads covered. And it was a way of acknowledging their place in God's order. Over time, especially as women were being given more opportunities to lead and to have their voice heard and respected in the church, the use of the covering has fallen off completely in the more progressive groups. But that's the reason for wearing it, and I think the name Sin Sifter is a kind of a lighthearted, derogatory name, mostly used by those who are wanting to get rid of it. And you can see the reason for the term because of the fine netting that it was made out of. That's why they called it a sin sifter.
Well, Phil, those are the questions that we've received, and I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. A very informative presentation. And at the beginning of the meeting, I meant to tell everyone that your class, Mennonites in the Valley, is our longest continuously running course. We thank you and your predecessor, Harvey Yoder, for hosting that class for so many years. And Sue tells me we've offered that course every spring, almost as long as the Institute has been around since, and that's been since 1996. So thank you for all of your dedication over the years, but especially today. And I quickly want to give a shout out to our events and lectures co-chairs, Chris Stern and Yogi Gillette, who are on the call. They manage a lot of these programs and help coordinate our event schedule. So I want to thank those as well. Any last words, Phil, to bring us to a close?
No, thank you for the opportunity to share. And I'm not opposed to any of you contacting me directly. If you have further questions, if you want to check out our church website at Parkview Church, it's pvmchurch.org, and there's links to my email. So if anyone wants to contact me later, feel free.
Thank you, Phil. And everyone, if you missed any part of the meeting today, that live link will be up on our website, hopefully this afternoon. Thank you for joining, and I hope you all remain safe and well until we can connect again online. Have a good day.
Thank you, Rodney.